Okay, this is a lab video. We're going to cover exercise 4 on tissues and exercise 5 on the skin. Make sure you have your lab manual to do this while you watch the video. So what we're going to do is an online lab, and you might be wondering how to do that. Well, really, we're just going to use our lab manual and this video and any online resources you need to complete the exercises for the lab. Again, probably budget the same amount of time we spend in class normally, 2 or 3 hours, and take some breaks. We're going to start with tissues. So exercise 4 is all about connective tissue and epithelial tissue. In your body, we'll think of a tissue as a collection of cells that have a similar function or that help each other function. So again, think of groups of cells when you think of tissues. And there are 4 basic tissue types in the body: connective tissue, epithelial tissue, which we'll cover today, and there's also muscle tissue and nervous tissue, which we'll cover at other times. If we think about the function of the tissue types, it's probably pretty easy to figure them out. You can always pause the video if you want to look at your lab manual and fill these out a little slower. But we're going to focus on support and strength, which is our connective tissue, and covering and lining, which is our epithelial tissue, and then finally we'll build skin. I just wanted you to think about, again, tissues have cells, and these are some examples of cells we would see in the various types of tissues: fibroblasts, connective tissue cell, neuron, nervous tissue cell, keratinocytes in the skin. Okay, I wanted to build an organ using tissues, and again, thinking about, well, what type of tissues do we need to build an organ? Well, whenever we build any organ, it's always just good to start with connective tissue. Connective tissue is always the basic organization and framework of any of our organs. So if we want to build connective tissue, we're going to need fibroblasts. Fibroblasts are the cells that can make the fibers that make up connective tissue. Fibers like collagen and fibers like elastin, elastic fibers, help the connective tissue have strength and flexibility. So these are made of proteins. The proteins are called collagen and elastin. Again, fibroblasts can make that, and they build the connective tissue, which would be the framework here of our bladder. Our urinary bladder is basically just a pouch to hold urine. Of course, whenever we have connective tissue, we're going to need to cover it up with some epithelium, or at least most of the time. So in order to connect our epithelium and connective tissue, we're going to need a basement membrane network of proteins, which you may have heard before. If you haven't, it's basically a protein zipper that holds the connective tissue to the epithelial cells covering it. So here we're covering the outside of our bladder, and we're going to cover it with a single layer of epithelial cells, again, to cover and protect the outside of our bladder. On the inside of our bladder, where we have our urine, we're going to need another set of epithelial cells. We're going to make these epithelial cells a little thicker and layer them in order to make a barrier between our urine and the rest of our bladder, the underlying connective tissue. All right, we're going to learn about the different types of epithelium and how we name them. But for now, we just need to remember that the epithelium lining and covering our bladder is for protection and for a barrier. The final thing that we're going to add to our urinary bladder are smooth muscle cells, or muscle cells. Again, you know that your bladder can contract and push urine out, so we need to add muscle cells. In this case, we call them smooth muscle cells, and they're not under our voluntary control. These, when activated by the brain and reflexes, will cause the bladder to squeeze and push the urine out of your body. And so in order to control, for example, the bladder with your brain and spinal cord, we're going to add some neurons, some nerve cells called neurons that can send signals down to your bladder and tell it to contract. We'll also have some sensory neurons that can tell your brain and your spinal cord when your bladder's full. You might remember afferent versus efferent signals to and from the brain. All right, we'll build the heart as well. That's in a lecture video. But same stuff: connective tissue, muscle, and epithelial tissue. All right, so let's learn a little bit about connective tissues. It's really a diverse group of tissues. We'll cover special connective tissues like bone and blood later. We're just going to talk about your average garden variety common connective tissues. Connective tissues are for strength and organization. So just think organizing, strength, like a scaffold that makes your organs. Sometimes connective tissue is considered loose, sometimes it's considered dense. What really makes that loose versus dense depends on how much of you have the fibers packed in there. If the collagen fibers are packed in, then we might call it dense. If it's more loose and there's some space in there for adipocytes and immune cells, we might call it loose connective tissue. But the point is, it's all connective tissue. The main cell of connective tissue, of course, is the fibroblast, because the fibroblast builds the collagen fibers. It builds the elastic fibers that make up connective tissue. Connective tissue actually doesn't have a lot of cells. It really has more of the stuff that the cells build, which we call connective tissue fibers. Again, we keep drawing and listing collagen and elastic fibers. Those are the two primary types of fibers that we'll find in our connective tissue. We'll also find adipocytes or fat cells. You can think of fat cells in connective tissue as space filler, cushion, and of course energy for when we don't have food. And so this is sort of a cartoon of the histology you might see of connective tissue on a microscope. And so we've got collagen fibers, elastic fibers, we've got the nucleus of cells, for example fibroblasts, maybe even some defense cells in there defending your body. And of course adipocytes will take up space often in our connective tissues. The histology dyes, you might remember, are hematoxylin to stain the nucleus of our cells, and eosin, which is great at staining things like collagen and elastin, and even proteins inside our cells. So remember, we call that an H&E stain for hematoxylin and eosin. And if you're looking at this and you're trying to figure out loose versus dense connective tissue, we'll look at more examples and you can read about it, but it really just has to do with the density and how packed are all those collagen and elastic fibers. You can even use an internet textbook. There's a link to one in Canvas called OpenStax, but otherwise you can just Google connective tissues, or you could just follow along the video. But I wanted just to show some cartoons of connective tissue, and you can get the idea of what is loose versus dense connective tissue. It's not really important as much as just appreciating that sometimes you have dense collagen fibers, sometimes the collagen fibers have a little more space. Don't forget, probably the nucleus you see in connective tissue, at least the ones we're looking at, are fibroblasts. The big orange bands or big pink bands are mostly collagen. Sometimes they'll be elastic fibers. Most of the time they're collagen fibers. You might see a random leukocyte inside of your connective tissue protecting you, and of course you might see adipocytes depending on the location. Most of these can be found in the skin, and so later we'll be looking at these. This one that's very dense would be an example of a tendon or ligament, which is made of connective tissue. Alright, so we're going to look at examples of connective tissue. You should think about the cells and the fibers you're seeing. Here's examples of connective tissues from the typical textbook, or in this case you can go to this website that we have listed there in your lab manual, and you can see sometimes the connective tissue looks very dense and packed with collagen, big collagen fibers. Sometimes it isn't even how dense it looks, it's just how big the collagen fibers look. Obviously, if you see a lot of adipose or a lot of fat cells in your connective tissue, you can just call it adipose tissue, but we know it's really adipose connective tissue. Don't forget, you're looking at mostly the eosin-stained collagen and probably some fibroblasts or immune cells in your connective tissue. Again, if you want to see examples of this, you can go online to this address and look at the virtual microscope images for connective tissue. All right, and we're going to look at some examples in class and also here. For example, if we pull up basically any organ will have connective tissue. In this case, we're looking at the trachea. And if we zoom in on the trachea, we're going to see some connective tissue because it's the basic structure of this round tube. Your trachea is your airway. And so we're moving it around a little bit, and what I wanted you to see was this example of epithelium and connective tissue. So again, this is our airway, your windpipe. So we have air in there exposed to some mucus that's on our little epithelial cells. You might remember that the cilia can move around that mucus and help clear your airways out. So this layer of epithelial cells sits on a basement membrane of protein, which helps hold that epithelial layer to the underlying connective tissue. And here you can see the connective tissue. I'm not sure if it's really dense or loose. I think it's kind of loose here. But you can see the collagen fibers in there. You can't really see the elastic fibers. They're pretty tiny and hard to see, but they're in there as well, adding flexibility and elasticity. And you can see some nuclei in there stained purple. Most of those are fibroblasts or immune cells in your connective tissue. All right, so that's an example, and we'll study more epithelium in the later part. You could look at another organ here. I believe this is the vagina, could be the esophagus, could even be the skin. It's all very similar in that you see a covering layer, stacks and stacks of epithelial cells, and then underlying you see some connective tissue. So we'll label it so it makes more sense here for you. So again, this, we could flip it over either way, but we have an exposed surface. That exposed surface is covered by epithelium or epithelial tissue. And those cells actually are layered, sort of like the cheek cells that we looked at in class. There's lots and lots of these epithelial cells, and they sit on top of the connective tissue. In this case, it'll have lots of collagen and lots of elastic fibers to make it strong and stretchy and flexible. We have fibroblasts in there. We probably have some immune cells in there as well to help protect you. Obviously, our reproductive system is exposed to a lot of stuff, so we have to have leukocytes. And those will usually be sitting in your connective tissue. All right, so other examples in your lab manual, you can check those out. Some questions. If you wanted to build basically the scaffold for an organ, I'd always start with collagen and collagen fibers. If you needed to know the cells to build that collagen, I would probably use a fibroblast. If I wanted my organ to contract, I would probably use some type of muscle cell. In the case of the bladder, we use smooth muscle cells. And then finally, if you want to cover the inside or the outside of your bladder or your heart, you're going to use epithelial cells. Again, thinking of the tissues we need to build our organs. This would be a good time to take a break. And we're going to cover epithelial tissues and epithelium next. All right, so what's epithelium or epithelial tissue? Again, epithelium is basically the covering cells that are either covering the exposed surfaces on the outside of our body or the inside of our body. Epithelia is just plural for epithelium. A lot of people like to talk about epithelium lining our organs and tubes. I like to just remember it as covering stuff. Epithelium basically is packed with cells. It's always connected to connective tissue. So this is a cartoon of some connective tissue with epithelium on top of it. Epithelium does not have a blood supply. It's considered avascular since it doesn't have blood vessels. But luckily, the connective tissue underneath has blood vessels. So those little covering cells, they like to pack in and hold on to each other. And then they also like to hold on to the basement membrane of proteins so that they can hold on to the underlying connective tissue. If that basement membrane doesn't work, you get blistering, and the epithelium literally pulls away from the connective tissue. So we're just reminding ourselves that the oxygen supply and glucose and things like that has to come from the blood vessels underneath the epithelium in the connective tissue. Don't forget that connective tissue has stem cells because most connective tissue layers die off on the outer layer, and so you need some stem cells to constantly replace those dying epithelial cells on the exposed surface. Some examples of epithelium include the lining of your trachea, the cover of the skin, the lining of the stomach, and we'll look at examples today. Okay, so we can actually look at different types of epithelium based on two factors, the layers and the shapes. So whenever you look at the type of epithelium you're looking at when you classify it, ask yourself two questions. How many cell layers do I see, and what shape are the cells? So what do we mean by cell layers? Well, do you see a single layer of cells so that the epithelium is one cell thick? Or do you see stacks of cells, more than one cell layer stacked on top of each other? If you see one cell layer, you should call the epithelium simple. If there's more than one cell thickness, then you should call it stratified. All right, simple or stratified. Next, you should consider the shape of the epithelial cells that you see. So we're going to draw some connective tissue, the basement membrane, and then we're drawing some cells. And some cells might be flat, some might be more round, others will be tall and rectangular, and this gives us our shapes: squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. Squamous cells are flat cells, kind of squished. Columnar are rectangular, and cuboidal are pretty much round or cubed. All right, so remember, you should always ask yourself, how many layers do I see in my epithelium, and what are the shapes that I see? And you can always pause this and go back in your lab manual and try to practice some of the vocabulary. All right, so let's look at some cartoons and figure out what type of epithelium we're looking at. We always have connective tissue, but we're really just paying attention to the epithelium. Both of these examples have a single cell layer, so we call them simple epithelium. And then next we should look at the shape. We see some round or cuboidal cells, and we see some flat or squamous cells. So these are two types of epithelium: simple cuboidal and simple squamous epithelium. What are the other types? Well, again, now we got to decide what layers do we see. The first one's easy and the second one's easy. They're both stratified. Actually, all three of these first three look stacked. So again, multiple layers, call it stratified. A single cell layer like the last one, call it simple. Then you might need to decide, well, wait a second. Seems like this one lettered E has some stacked and some simple. So is it simple or is it stratified? Well, scientists noticed this too, and they called it fake or pseudostratified, because not every cell is stacked. If you ever have trouble remembering, just look for cilia in our class. If you see cilia, it's pseudostratified. All right, what about the shape of these cells? Well, if we start with the one lettered F, it's pretty easy. Those are long rectangular ones. They're columnar. Also, the one lettered E with the cilia, those are pretty long, so we call those columnar. The other ones, this is a little tough on D. The mature cells are flat. The stem cells are cuboidal, so we use the mature cells to determine that it's squamous. So we call that one stratified squamous. If we look at this last one labeled C, we see that some are cuboidal, some are columnar or rectangular, and we couldn't really decide, so is it columnar, is it cuboidal? Well, scientists came up with a term and they called this one transitional. All right, so all four of these are different types of epithelium. We've got simple columnar, pseudostratified columnar epithelium, stratified squamous epithelium, and stratified transitional epithelium. And so you should probably practice thinking about the layers and then the shapes. And with the cartoons, it's pretty easy. We're going to move to actual real histology images next. All right, so these are the only types of epithelium we're going to need to memorize for our class. And there are 6 of them, so it's not easy, but we'll practice and you'll be able to do it. Let's start with stratified squamous epithelium. You find this covering your skin, lining your esophagus, lining the vagina, anything that's abrasive and protective. So we're going to go to this website, and you can too at home, and we're going to use the virtual microscope. So you can type that in there or Google it, and we're going to start with stratified squamous. Again, it's going to be layered and flat. So if we go to the virtual microscope, and we type in, or we select epithelium, since that's what we're looking at, and push apply, it's going to give us a list of epithelium. We're going to start with stratified squamous. You could either look at the vagina or the esophagus. We're going to look, since we already looked at it before, at the vagina. So again, if we zoom in on the epithelium is going to be lining the inside surface, and it's always sitting on top of connective tissue, and in the case of the vagina, some muscle. So what type of epithelium do we expect to see? Well, it's for abrasion and protection, and so we're going to expect it to be many layers, right? And we can see how many layers there. If we start counting the cells, that's quite a few layers thick. So it's definitely stratified. We can see the little stem cells there, and then as the cells mature, they actually start to flatten out. So again, let's think about naming the type. We got to think of the layers and the shape. So again, it's stratified because we have maybe a dozen or more layers of thickness of cells. Then we look at the shape of the cells. The shape of the cells once they're mature are flat, so we're going to call it squamous. Don't worry that the stem cells, they're always cubed. So we really look at the mature cells. So this is stratified squamous epithelium, and we find that covering our epidermis of our skin, the outer surface of our skin. We see that in inside our cheek, our esophagus, and then this organ we just looked at. All right, so just pick one and memorize that for your quiz. Okay, next we're going to do simple squamous epithelium. You find this on the pleura, the pericardium, inside blood vessels. When it is covering the outside of your organs, we call it mesothelium. When it's lining your blood vessels, it's called endothelium. If you have trouble memorizing that, don't worry about it. So again, let's look at simple squamous epithelium. This is actually part of your digestive organs here, and we're going to zoom in on a blood vessel that serves them. Again, a blood vessel should have simple squamous epithelium. What does that mean? Simple should be one cell layer thick, and squamous should be flat. So we're looking at a blood vessel, and we're lining the blood vessel on the blood side. We've got our connective tissue, maybe some collagen and some muscle in there, and then we have our basement membrane and this really thin, hard to see layer of cells, and we're just outlining some of those cells. Since it's one layer thick, we call it simple, and since they're flat, we call it squamous. So we have simple squamous epithelium lining our blood vessels. Again, it has a special name called endothelium, but we'll have time to memorize that if you can't remember that. Simple squamous epithelium is also called endothelium inside your blood vessels. That's adipose, connective tissue, right? Adipose tissue is just connective tissue. All right, let's look at, this would actually be like the peritoneum. Since this is part of your digestive tract, this is the covering of our digestive tract, so we call it the peritoneum. Well, it has a simple squamous epithelial cover on the outside. So we've got some connective tissue always, because that gives us strength, and it holds the epithelium. And now we're just outlining this flat layer of single cells here, which we call simple squamous epithelium. Since this happens to be around our internal organs, this is, for example, our peritoneum, the connective tissue and the epithelium, we can call those epithelial cells mesothelium. So anytime you have simple squamous epithelial cells on the outside of your internal organs, we can call it mesothelium. Famous cancer comes from these. It's called mesothelioma. All right, again, the epithelium is just that one little layer of cells sitting on top of connective tissue. All right, the next one we're going to look at is simple columnar epithelium. You find this inside your digestive organs like your stomach and your intestines. We find it on our virtual microscope list here as small intestine. It says 40X, H and E, and so this is actually your food digesting tube, and the food digests inside that mushed up tube there. So right in there, if we zoom in, we're going to see the epithelial cells that line our intestine. And again, we'll label it so we can see them, but we should hopefully remember these are going to be simple and columnar. So we've got our food digesting in there, right? And it's not really food anymore since it's digesting. We want to get that food across that single layer of cells and into our body so it can be taken up by the blood vessels in our connective tissue. You have a ton of defense cells in your digestive tract, as you could imagine, in the connective tissue. All right, so what type of epithelium are we looking at here? Well, they're rectangular, and there's a single layer of cells, so we call it simple columnar epithelium. And the simple columnar epithelium is famous for having microvilli, especially in our digestive tract. So microvilli, you can remember, are these little ruffles to increase surface area on the surface of our cells. And that's going to help increase the surface area for digestion and, more importantly, probably absorption of nutrients like glucose and amino acids and all that cool stuff that we want to get from our digested food into our body. All right, so this is simple columnar epithelium. Don't forget, you can see those tiny little microvilli. You can barely see them, but they're that kind of thick border of the cells. All right, next we're going to move to our kidneys, and the tiny little pee-making tubes called tubules in our kidneys are made of simple cuboidal epithelium. All right, so what do we mean by little tubes? Well, they're basically like little hoses, little tiny tubes, and if we were to cut them open, we could see that they're made of these square or cuboidal cells, and there's a single layer of them helping process the pre-urine, and so we call tiny tubes tubules, and those are found in our kidney. All right, so if we go to the virtual microscope, we can find the 40X kidney simple cuboidal epithelium. Click on web scope and opens up a chunk of our kidney. This is actually a pretty big chunk of your kidney, and if you zoom in, you could see millions, literally millions of these tiny tubes that are made out of simple cuboidal epithelial cells, kidney epithelial cells. Let's label a couple so you can see. So if we just grab any random tube and circle it, this would be one of those tubes, and we could see these very round square cells. Again, if you see round or square or cubed cells, we're going to call those cuboidal. Since it's a single layer of cells for each tube, we call it simple cuboidal epithelium. Again, this is most famous for our kidneys. You'll see it sometimes in ducts and glands like sweat glands and mammary glands, but we'll stick with the kidney here. Again, you can cut them transversely or longitudinally a long ways, and you can still see those simple cuboidal epithelial cells. All right, next we're going to go to the trachea, or our airways called bronchi, and that's going to be the example of pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Your hint to always know that you've found that one is to look for cilia. So if you see cilia, then you know you found pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So we're going to look at the 40X trachea. Again, our trachea is our windpipe. So what's it carrying? Well, it's carrying air around, and this epithelium is going to need to line or cover that airway exposed to the air. Let's zoom in and label so you know what we're looking at here. Right, again, this is our trachea. So we definitely have air exposed to our trachea. Our little cells are going to be covered with some mucus to help protect us and keep them moist and catch dirt and stuff from the air. Of course, we always have connective tissue and a basement membrane, and then stuck on top of the basement membrane, we're going to have our epithelium. You might even see some little red blood cells and blood vessels in the connective tissue in this histology image. All right, so we're outlining some of these cells. Don't forget there's some stem cells, but then the cells that are mature are these big, long, rectangular cells. So again, this is going to be columnar epithelium. You can see the cilia. The cilia are these little extensions of the cell membrane that can move, and I always remember that they look like a toothbrush, and they're really easy to see compared to microvilli, which are almost invisible. So cilia move the mucus around and move stuff out of your airways. It looks stacked, but remember we said they're not all stacked, so we call this pseudostratified. And since they're rectangular, we call them columnar. All right, so we have pseudostratified columnar epithelium, and we're going to remember that in our trachea. The final epithelium that we're going to look at lines our bladder and our ureters. If you just want to remember one or the other, you'll be set. So bladder, think of stratified transitional epithelium. What do we mean by stratified transitional epithelium? Well, we're going to see that in a second here. So they don't have bladder, so we're going to select the ureter, the undistended, so we don't want it too stretched out. So we see this tube that carries urine from our kidneys to our bladder. Inside the middle there is going to be the urine, and there is the covering epithelial cells. So again, this is considered stratified or layered, and then the shape we couldn't decide, so we called it transitional. All right, so let's just label this again. We'd have the P on the exposed surface, the urine going down our ureter. We have the epithelium covering it, covering the inside surface. We have a basement membrane, which you might be able to see, and then, of course, connective tissue. And we even have some muscle in our ureter. All right, so this is definitely stacked. I hope you can see that. It's many cell layers thick, maybe 8, 10 on top of the stem cells, so we call it stratified. When we look at the shape of these cells, though, we see cuboidal ones up top, we see columnar ones down bottom, and so we couldn't decide on the shape, whether it was columnar or cuboidal, and scientists and histologists decided to call it transitional. So we're going to call it stratified transitional epithelium. We're going to remember that it lines our bladder and our ureters. All right, so those were the epithelium that you need to know. You should definitely practice looking at some and thinking about, well, what does that look like? Does it look stratified? You have images in your lab manual. You should practice identifying the different types. So remember shape and layers, or do layers first and then shape. And then, of course, the answers are for you in your lab manual. And so I definitely encourage you to read these answers because they will explain them in more detail than we're talking about in our video. It'll really help you on your quiz for sure. I wanted to mention that many of the cancers that you've probably heard of are usually derived from epithelial cells, epithelial tissue. Most, but not all cancers are epithelial derived. They give them a name, and that name is carcinoma. This is time for another break. And then we're going to move on and talk about the skin, or integumentary. All right, our final part of this lab is exercise 5, and we're going to cover the anatomy of the skin, and then you're going to use your internet skills to look up some clinical topics related to the skin. All right, the skin has some basic layers, and those basic layers, you've probably heard of these, are the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. The epidermis is epithelium. The dermis and the hypodermis are basically just connective tissue. So that's why the skin's great to build, because we already know about connective tissue and epithelium. It's going to be very easy for us to build the skin. All right, so if you think of the skin as a big chunk or block, it basically has those layers, those parts that we just said. The main layer of the skin, by far the thickest layer and the strongest layer, is the dermis. The dermis is basically lots and lots of collagen fibers, elastic fibers to help give the skin its strength and elasticity. The main cell type building the dermis is going to be the fibroblast. All right, so the fibroblast is going to make all that connective tissue of your dermis. It's even going to make the connective tissue of your hypodermis too. But so that is the dermis. It's by far the thickest layer. It also has a lot of blood supply, not only to nourish the skin, but really to help cool you off. If you remember temperature regulation, you know skin blood vessels are important for that. All right, we're just going to make that dermis and that collagen really, really dense. It kind of shifts from dense connective tissue at the bottom to more loose connective tissue right underneath the epithelium. Now we're drawing in our subcutaneous layer, or I like to call it the hypodermis, meaning underneath or below the dermis. We're drawing it yellow because it has lots of adipocytes. If you remember, adipocytes like to fill up the spaces of our connective tissue. And then the final covering layer of our skin, of course, is called the epidermis. It's epithelial tissue, epithelial cells. So remember, there's some stem cells at the base, which gives rise to new keratinocytes. Those keratinocytes flatten out and eventually die, but they're still all part of your epidermis. All right, so the epidermis is really packed cells on the top, or covering. So those are the three main layers of our skin. What I wanted you to think about next is, where are the cells of the skin located? This first set of cells is found in the epidermis. The next set of cells are found in the dermis and the hypodermis. And then we have some cells like neurons and leukocytes, defense cells. They're pretty much found everywhere in your skin, so we won't probably label those as much. All right, so if we go back and look at our skin, Don't forget where we have our epithelial cells, we have our stem cells that eventually give rise to cells that will die. Also in the epidermis, we have these cells called melanocytes. You might remember that melanocytes are what give your epidermis pigment, and your skin its pigment. And so it can make you darker by making pigment and passing it on to the keratinocytes. All right, keratinocytes are famous in your epidermis. We're drawing in blood vessels again. I guess I really wanted to remind you about the blood vessels that you find not in the epidermis, but in the dermis and the hypodermis. You have hair follicles, and hair is derived from the actual epidermal cells. So even though hair is found located down in the dermis, it's actually made from cells of your epidermis, so epithelial cells. Same with the sweat gland that we're drawing in here. Sweat glands, oil glands, hair follicles are derived from epithelial cells. That's important to remember, even though they're found located down in the dermis. So sweat glands come in different varieties, but they have a pore, a duct, and then of course the glandular cells that actually make the secretion. In this case, this is sweat to help cool you off through evaporation. So we'll learn those are called eccrine sweat glands. We also have oil glands. The oil glands are usually connected to your hair follicles, and those are called sebaceous glands. Sebaceous glands make oil, or a secretion called sebum, and that oil then is able to moisturize the dead hair follicle as well as the dead outer layer of your epidermis. So again, just think it helps create moisture so that the dead stuff doesn't flake away so fast. All right, just to review, the glands again are derived, glands in hair, from epithelium. We have the oil glands, which we call sebaceous glands. Those are located near your hair follicles. We have two kinds of sweat glands. Eccrine sweat glands make a watery sweat that cools you off. Apocrine sweat glands are found in your armpit and your pubic region, and it makes a thicker secretion, which probably gives you your scent. All right, so it doesn't cool you off. Instead, it actually gives you a scent. So make sure you know the difference between eccrine sweat glands and apocrine sweat glands. They pretty much look the same, but just know their different function. I wanted to remind you that hair follicles have stem cells, melanocytes, epithelial cells that help create the hair. The hair is really just dead cells, but it's derived from epithelial cells. Let's practice labeling this model from lab. We can see the epidermis is the outer layer, the bulk of the skin is the dermis, and then the lower layer we can call the hypodermis or subcutaneous layer. Think about what cells you have and where they are located. Think about other structures like the hair follicles and the sweat glands. Don't forget where you have your epidermal stem cells at the base, and then your dead cells up at the top. You have eccrine sweat glands, which can secrete sweat and cool you off. You have sebaceous or oil glands. Sebaceous glands produce an oil called sebum, and that sebum helps moisturize the dead layer of skin and the hair follicles. Adipocytes, fibroblasts would be found in the dermis and the hypodermis, whereas you have keratinocytes, melanocytes, and of course stem cells located in your epidermis. All right, don't forget to practice labeling that. Okay, the final thing we're going to do is look at the specific layers or regions of your epidermis. All right, so don't forget, we're talking about the base of the epidermis going all the way up to the superficial part of your epidermis, and we're just giving them Latin names to remind us what they do and why they're important. All right, so we're going to actually zoom in just on the epidermis. All right, we're not looking at any other part of the skin. So if we look at our whole skin picture here, we're just going to zoom in just on this outer epidermis. All right, we're not going to look at the dermis or hypodermis. We're going to zoom in on our epidermis, and we're going to name the different regions. All right, this is straight out of your lab manual, and you can label this in there too. All right, so we're going to start and name them in Latin. We start with stratum, and then we have the basalli, spinosum, granulosum, lucidum, and corneum. All right, so we're going from the base to most superficial. Students came up with a way to memorize this. College life gives students bad grades. That's actually going from superficial to deep, but it can help you know the first letter of each stratum. All right, stratum basale has the stem cells, then the melanocytes. The spinosum has your brand new keratinocytes. The stratum granulosum, those little keratinocytes are starting to die by apoptosis. They're undergoing cell death. Lucidum is just this weird clear layer. And most interesting, I think, is the stratum corneum, where you have all these dead keratinocyte remnants and lots of the protein left over called keratin. All right, so maybe pause it or replay this and make sure you can name the 5 Latin names of the regions of the epidermis. If we scroll slowly through this histology image of the skin, I just wanted you to see how thick that dermis is compared to the epidermis. You may have heard of HPV, human papillomavirus, which can actually infect your keratinocytes and cause things like warts and abnormal cells growing in your epidermis. Again, the epidermis has these layers, the new cells, the stem cells, the dead cells, and so make sure you can try to remember which layer is which. All right, we have connective tissue with a cover, just like we learned before. All right, the final thing you need to do before you take your quiz is you need to look up about 4 to 5 of these clinical terms and use your anatomy, use your internet skills to come up with a good definition that makes you sound really smart and makes you get points on your quiz. All right, I will see you guys in class. Don't forget, we will have a lab in class when we return on exercise 4 and exercise 5. See you guys.